Morning all. In round 2 of the tournament, currently underway in the chess Olympiad 2012, the very powerful Ukrainian team, which is basically averaging over 2,700, 4 GMs, all over 2,700 except for Aljanov, who's 2693 in this match. Ivanchuk 2769 is facing a lower rated GM of the Qatar team, Al-Modiahki Mohamad 2542. So let's have a look at this game. E4 was played by Al-Modiahki, and Ivanchuk plays the Sicilian defence. After knight f3 d6 we don't see the open Sicilian, but instead bishop b5 check, which is quite popular at the moment. Bishop d7, an exchange of light squared bishops, knight takes d7, and here not a Maroczy bind type move with c4, but white plays for the construction of a centre with c3 and d4, another popular plan in this position. So after knight f6, queen e2, and now we see after rook c8 the move c3, white aiming to construct that classical pawn centre. Queen c7, and okay, knight a3 was played in this position. Although it looks awkward, it might grab a tempo from the queen potentially if black doesn't play a6, or alternatively it can reroute like this, so it's not the end of the world, moving the knight to the rim here, only temporarily. After e6 we see d4, so white's got that classical centre. These two pawns side by side with these breaks can be quite dangerous at the appropriate moment. Black, Ivanchuk, he locks down on d5, he plays d5 himself, changing the structure of the position. White wasn't really tempted to play e takes d5 here. That would give black a nice kind of blockading knight, and it looks quite unpleasant actually for this bishop and the c-file generally. Instead, white elected for e5, which is quite committal, and inviting the knight to come to e4, which is annoying. There's annoying pressure on c2 and c3, so even if a knight got back to c3, black's got the luxury option of knight takes c3, inflicting perhaps structural damage, isolating this pawn, securing a backward pawn on the semi-open c-file. So would that be actually positional murder almost? Well, we'll see. Knight b5, queen b6. Okay, and now we see bishop e3, which is a clever move, not minding temporarily perhaps losing a pawn if a6 was played here, which it wasn't. Ivanchuk played move bishop e7. If a6, I suspect white has enough play in this position because black's underdeveloped, so say takes, it would be a bit risky to take this pawn. Something like rook b1 and then maybe queen b2 after. Ivanchuk doesn't want to give white play like that when he hasn't developed his pieces. He just plays bishop e7. He's taking his time about this, and now he gives of course white the opportunity to safely come back to c3 now without losing a pawn. So after castles, knight c3. Now of course there's the structural damage inflicted. So knight takes c3, b takes, we have a backward pawn and semi-open file. It looks very unfortunate, this aspect of the position. But from an attacker's perspective, of course the pawn wedge chain can be very dangerous for the black king, because the pawn wedge chain means that the soft spot h7 could be a problem later if there's no defensive knight on either f6 or f8. But if the knight's used up just sitting on f8, then it can't be used for trying to exploit white's queenside weaknesses like c4. Okay, so what does Ivanchuk do here? Rook c6 looks as though he's just going to pile up on c3, maybe even treble the two rooks and queen soon. So for the moment doubling queen and rook. h4 looks like an attacking move, but you might ask for what point? If there's ever knight g5, surely bishop g5, and it looks like a strategic crush almost. It looks like the knight would be better than the bishop. Black can just blockade the position with g6. Where would white's counterplay be? This is the intriguing thing about this game. It looks as though white was virtually dead in this position because of the backward pawn, and in the positions that kind of emerged soon after. Knight b6 showing that the knight is not going to be sitting around babysitting h7, which means actually this soft spot could theoretically be a problem for black in this pawn chain configuration. But how? That's very interesting. Queen d3 pointing at the soft spot. which means now if black doesn't play h6, then knight g5 is actually a cheeky threat, which would force basically bishop g5 in some instances. Rook c8, piling up on that poor c pawn. So is this strategic crush? Is it positional murder? How does white get some counterplay from this position? White plays the meek looking rook b3, babysitting c3 for a moment. Then we see knight c4, and now we see this cheeky move knight g5 threatening queen takes h7. Does Ivanchuk want to play a move like g6, weakening his dark squares? Well, then the story could continue, perhaps, with maybe something like h5 at some point. Instead, Ivanchuk does the more radical bishop takes g5. It's more committal. It changes the structure again. So h takes g looks as though it gives white a little bit of dynamism. Although the pawns are doubled, there's potential dynamism on the h file in some variations. Believe it or not, you wouldn't actually imagine that with the rooks looking rather awkward like this, nannying the c3 pawn at the moment. Okay, rook a6, and now the a pawn also needs to be safeguarded. Rook a4, and it looks as though, okay, Ivanchuk's preparing something like this maybe, but is the rook awkward on a4? g3, and it looks as though, hang on a sec, maybe king g2 is going to be useful. Or alternatively, this rook could potentially swing cheekily to h2 to sort of eye that soft spot, that h7 pawn. So it's dual purpose. It's not just about any king g2s. It's this idea that this h7 in this structure with this pawn chain wedge is offering usually an attacking player some counterplay chances, which on the surface don't look that visible. Okay, b6, bishop f4, which means the queen can now go to f3 potentially. Knight a5 hitting the rook goes back. Queen c4, white definitely doesn't want an exchange of queens. He's got to keep the queen on here to have any chance of survival. Note also the queen's attacking a2, so he's got to protect that pawn as well if he doesn't want the queens off. This move ticks both boxes, protects the pawn as well. Knight c6, and it looks as though potentially knight takes d4 now is on because of the c-file pressure. So white protects c2, safeguarding against a move like knight takes d4, and now knight e7, and again looks like a kind of strategic crush in inverted commas, because if white hasn't got counterplay and these rooks look really awkward, then isn't this a much better knight than the bishop? Can black just not set up positional blockade? Black set up a positional blockade, and where would white's counterplay be? So now we see rook a3, queen's attacked, and queen d2. So white's spending a lot of moves just nannying either the a pawn or the c pawn at the moment. Rook c4, and now queen e2 using a pin. And if black doesn't want to give white that c file access, so he plays actually just queen c8. Still looks comfortable, and it looks incredible now, this next move. You think a knight on f5 might not be that brilliant because there's g4, but what about a knight on d5? Why would white want to allow black a huge knight on d5? Well, this next move is a shocker from a positional point of view. Rook takes c4, giving Vassily Ivanchuk maybe a position. He's probably thinking now, really, did this guy get the GM title? What is this knight doing? Why would he be allowing this huge, gigantic knight on d5? So this pawn and this pawn are now really being tortured, potentially. Where would white's counterplay be in this position? It's a mystery. After knight d5, well, bishop c1 hitting the rook. And then we see queen e4. And it looks as though the queen's got evil intent again against the positional blockade. It looks as though that maybe f4 and rook h2 are on the cards as a source of counterplay. So the pawn chain, the actual pawn chain implied resources are crudely, let's be honest, about this soft spot h7 and the lack of easy defence. It cramps black's defensive resources. and black's resources have been kind of consumed here, torturing white's queenside. This rook, you know, okay, although it's attacking a2, this rook's not only defending a2, it's got the promise sometimes, in some variations, of switching for an attack to justify now the queen, which is nicely centralised on e4, which is another feature of this pawn chain. So f4, and it looks as though, yeah, white is not as dead as it would first appear here. This wasn't as ludicrous, this exchange on c4, as it first appears. There's a little bit of dynamic play going on here. Queen a6, and the bishop is ready to help defend with a3 now. Okay, queen b5. The queen can't be allowed to infiltrate. This looks really, really dangerous if there's a queen infiltration. Queen on b1 would imply knight c3 and other stuff. So the queen's kicked. Okay, and now we see rook c2 in this position. c3 looks too dangerous because of queen a8. So that can't be taken. So everything's secure at the moment. g6. And now it looks as though knight c3 might be more likely to be on the cards. And here, white plays with huge, huge energy around h7, because it looks as though, well, what was this h7 dream anyway? Isn't the queen now just on granite? You know, what can we do with h7 potentially in this position? How does the queen and rook coordinate on h7? This is the problem to solve. I wonder if you can guess white's next move, which does actually help solve this problem of getting the queen and rook to coordinate on h7. If I give you 10 seconds now, this is a surprising move. Starting now. What does white play? Okay, he plays f5. It means that the queen can actually come to h4, and the crude rook h2 might be on the cards then, and that's kind of dangerous for h7. So black takes queen h4, and indeed rook h2, which white's been plotting all along. Forget structure, forget the double pawns, white's got to play for the attack here. And we see now in this position queen b5. And here white evicts the queen again. And now finally rook h2, and the defensive resource, very good one I believe, is played h5, temporarily just sacking a pawn to nullify white's pieces now with king h7. On the other hand, you know, this pawn is dangerous. It can be used with the queen. If the queen ever came to a dark square, it would be threatening mate. So this is a danger point now for black, even though it's quite elegant in design in closing off that h file. There is a risk factor associated with it. Any dark square, even f8 or f6, just to get g7 as a mate threat is very dangerous here. So let's have a look. Was there another way of defending? Giving up h7 is a little bit risky. I've checked this out briefly with engine. This kind of manoeuvring is dangerous for black, where rook h7 can be, you know, very, very dangerous. So this defense looks like a great idea. So for the moment, you know, Ivanchuk's still sitting in a kind of strategic crush looking position with the classic better knight versus bishop, the queenside pawns being tortured, potential to create a pass pawn here with a longer term plan of b4 where this c4 pawn would be liberated as a pass pawn. Okay, so what does white do? More energetic play. Rook f2 with the intention, and this is really quite amazing now. First of all, rook f2 is clever not just for the f file but for blocking a check here, so that knight takes c3 is not threatening queen d4 check, but knight takes c3 is too risky here. Queen f6 and that g7 mate threat is pretty strong. So for the moment, Ivanchuk he wants to sort out that problem and make this actually a meaningful threat, knight takes c3, without any queen f6. So his next move, b5, ticks two boxes, not just for the longer term plan, but also the rook can now come to a6 and cover f6, which means that knight takes c3 will be on the cards. So white plays with great energy here though. He plays g4, and it looks as though at first, what is this about? Is it just losing a pawn for nothing? F takes g4, but a surprising move in this position as the surprising idea behind G4 is revealed. I wonder if you can guess it. A sort of attacking move in this position is played, which you wouldn't kind of suspect. It looks as though white's been sat on without much counterplay. So what does white play here if I give you 10 seconds starting from now? Okay, white plays king h2. He's actually going to play king g3 and get his pawn back. It's really cheeky, but if he gets his pawn back like that, then f7 is going to be a problem, and this pawn might be a problem. So rook a6, with the idea he's actually really making that potential threat though without queen f6 as well. King g3, and white is getting his pawn back. f5, there's the en passant, which is very useful. So knight takes c3 though. There's no queen f6. He can do this here. Queen takes g4. If black takes the queen, he might be in trouble now because of the f7 and the h6, and white would have a little bit of counterplay, some real counterplay. We see instead queen d5, which introduces, of course, the threat of knight e4 check, winning the exchange. King h2, stepping out of that. Knight e4. And now, okay, after rook f4, we see a very clever move from Ivanchuk. f5, and actually, technically, I believe black is still okay in this position. And especially so after this technical blunder from white here. White, to stay in the game at about equal, should be using the g7 weakness by playing the technical move rook takes f5. Rook takes f5. And there's some long drawing lines which I looked at earlier stemming from this. But in the game, e takes f was played, and actually black stands better, because what's happened with e takes f is that the queen now has access to h5, and black's actually better. He's immediately threatening things like queen h5 potentially, but for the moment f7 is really dangerous. But okay, so that has to be dealt with. The pawn's taken. Remember, queen h5 is now a resource which has been introduced by this e takes f. So technically, black now stands better. White plays queen c8, and here again, black stands better in this position, but he plays, unfortunately, Ivanchuk in this position played a horrendous blunder. He played actually the move rook c6 and resigned with his move. He resigned with his move not because of the danger of this pawn with check, because there's knight d7 is adequate here, but in fact queen f8 threatens the crude queen g7 mate and hits the knight. And okay, black might throw in some checks, but if they run out, then that's it for black. If the knight ever moves off, then it's even more dangerous for things like rook f7. So this would be really, really unpleasant for black. And the queen can't take here because of taking and the discovered check, justifying the bishop. But in this position, instead of the howler rook c6, queen h5 check immediately, from a technical perspective, would have been fine here, believe it or not. Because a move like king g3, there might be a resource like g5 here in this particular position. And this should be just about okay. g5 hitting the rook. I know this rook is also attacked, and black should be okay, but it requires precision, engineering to play like this. But the check, yeah, he was in time pressure apparently in this position when he played rook c6. But queen h5 check, and apparently black is okay. He's a pawn up, and it's an okay. It's a good position, potentially in black's favour. But this howler rook c6, he resigned with it. Queen f8, and it's difficult to defend. Let's just engine verify this conclusion here with Houdini here. In this position, if I drag this up, hope you can see black slightly better with queen h5 check, king g2 check, check, whoops, now queen c6. Black will be liking this. It's only a small advantage for black, but it's clearer than before. The queens are off, a lot of the problems are solved, and black's got this past c pawn. So in fact, if we rewind back, white made a kind of blunder with e takes f, as I mentioned. Let's have a look at rook takes f5. The move here for black is g5, the technical move. But even so, after bishop takes g5, it's white that's got the tiny advantage technically. Queen f3, it should be drawable for black. Check, check, takes. This kind of continuation, it's about equal anyway. So let's just go back. So let's just see from an engine point of view how the evaluation shifts in this game. So it seems white was okay for a while and started to get a bad position. I think once the structural damage had occurred, the engine started looking as though it's really in black's favour, this position. You see that structural damage with knight takes c3, and black's got the queenside play, which in theory should be to black's advantage. But white's playing very energetically to justify the pawn chain, the advanced pawn chain. It's an instructive game from seemingly generating some counterplay with this pawn chain, making use of the soft spot h7 in effect, with some crude looking moves here, allowing the doubling of pawns, but this h-file becomes a latent resource in the position, as this g3 implies if the rook can swing across to coordinate potentially with the queen. So white is playing a lot of defensive moves on the queen side though in the meantime, and very surprisingly in this position played rook takes c4 coming up, giving this humongous looking knight after d takes. But engines don't mind rook takes c4, it's apparently one of the strongest moves, but this humongous looking knight, what is it actually worth here on d5 when white's still got this potential counterplay on the h file? In fact, f3 was preferred here, maybe with the same idea of h file counterplay but a bit less committal perhaps, rather than f4. If we look at this line, okay, so that's very interesting that okay, we get this kind of mighty looking blockade soon with g6, and black's sitting better, slightly better, less than half a pawn at the moment, and now with f5 it's a kind of it's a gamble to generate this play in a way, but it's justified here. Well, definitely by the game continuation. It put Ivanchuk under a lot of pressure, and this other pawn sacrifice now, quite surprising, the use of the king here to come and recollect that pawn and put more difficulties black's way. But in this position, okay, this move knight e4 might not have been the best here. There might have been f5 with the idea, technical idea of queen d7, creating, using that pin. Even so, white apparently is okay there. So knight e4, and now we see f5, and this is maybe white's blunder is e takes f, giving black potentially access to h5. So rook takes f5 was apparently stronger here than e takes f. After knight takes, it looks as though black again is in the driving seat technically, and should have played queen h5. Instead, the howler is played rook c6, unfortunately for Ivanchuk. So queen h5 check, still with a good position. After rook c6, he resigns with the move. Let's just look at queen f8. So in this position, the checks, if we check here, king f2, if we check now here with knight e4, king e3 or king f3, king e3, it looks dangerous for queen g1. It looks scary, these checks, but they just run out. The king can actually munch, and the checks are going to just run out here at some point. A check here, maybe king d5, and there's still this ominous, queen g7 hanging over black. It's actually a forced mate in 6 now, so the checks just run out there. Yeah. So rook takes f5, and this g5 would be the best move here. Okay, so going back to the game continuation, pardon me. In the game continuation, queen f8, the strongest move in this position, not queen b7, and that looks as though black's checks are running out. So Ivanchuk resigned after playing rook c6. A complicated game, up and down struggle, and okay, in summary, it shows that a pawn chain, the e5 pawn chain, has some latent cheeky resources revolving around h7, some soft spots, which you think almost unimaginable, but they were to Al-Modiahki his credit, they were brought out. These resources were brought out to the fore in this game through very creative, sacrificial, play, sacking pawns, putting pressure on Ivanchuk, and basically maybe causing Ivanchuk to be low on time and causing that horrendous blunder. So great credit to this grandmaster, who has apparently been around 2600 in the past. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.